welcome to this TMD World Quick Chat. Today, we'll be discussing storm management, specifically the 360-degree approach and the different stages of storm response. I'm Nikki Chandler, Editorial Director for TMD World, and today we're speaking with Chris Ricciuti, Founder and CEO of Noteworthy AI. Chris, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about your background to start off.
Sure. Well, I've been in the utility industry for about 8 years. My background, however, is in technology and AI, using AI and ML to automate, manual, often mundane business processes. Noteworthy itself was started about 5 years ago. We're about 30 people strong, and we're working with utilities throughout the United States and beyond. Basically, what we've developed is a vehicle-mounted camera and AI system that helps utilities increase their situational awareness on the distribution grid while reducing cost. And of course, that has reliability, resiliency, and safety benefits that come along with it.
Oh, thank you so much. So yeah, and today we're going to be talking about storm response specifically, and I know that plays into it. But you guys have some great information that you're sharing with utility industry. So let's get into that. Why is storm response such a critical challenge for utilities today? And really, how has that changed in recent years?
Yeah, I think essentially we all read the headlines around frequency and intensity of extreme weather, but ultimately it's three converging factors in our view. So aside from that frequency and intensity and severity of the extreme weather events, there's customer expectations for rapid restoration. I always like to say it's kind of like that me economy methodology, if you will, instant gratification, everything available at your fingertips with mobile phones. That same expectation is kind of now translating to power and whether or not it's on or not. And if it goes out, given the increased frequency and intensity of storms, there's an unrealistic sometimes expectation that the power is restored instantaneously, which we all know is not the case. I think that also dovetails with regulatory scrutiny, which is intensifying. So as these storms increase in severity and intensity, regulators are putting utilities under the microscope to ensure that their processes that they have in place are efficient and power is restored, in fact, quickly. And I think third, and perhaps the most critical, is that utilities are still using, I like to say, 20th century manual inspection methods against these new 21st century storm patterns, right? The hurricanes of 100 years ago are not the hurricanes of now, but ultimately the tools used to assess damage and restore power as quickly as possible are the same as 100 years ago, essentially. So that's the fundamental bottleneck as we view it. It's kind of the time-intensive and manual process of assessing damage before the repairs can even begin.
Yeah, so obviously, yeah, a lot's changed, and like you said, expectations and even the storms, and what we need to bring the technology up to where we are now, and even future. So you guys have talked about a 360-degree approach, I've heard, to storm response. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means, and how does that differ from traditional methods?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start first by defining the traditional method.
Mhm.
Basically, each storm is treated as an isolated incident. So the storm hits, crews scramble to assess damage, and then the restoration begins. The 360-degree approach kind of flips that on its head and essentially creates a continuous improvement cycle. You could think of it as that across three phases. So the first is pre-storm. So it's all about proactive grid hardening, often using AI-driven vulnerability mapping, but all of it happening before the storm even happens. The second is post-storm. So that is that storm patrol or damage assessment process, but it's not doing it the old labor-intensive manual way. It's doing it the new, faster, at-scale way with cameras and AI, potentially. And the third leg of the stool, if you will, is quality control. So we all know that after a storm, it's once the damage is assessed, it's restore power at any cost. And oftentimes that restorations work is happening from contractors or by contractors. And corners are often cut. And so the power is not necessarily restored to specification. So the third leg of the stool is post-repair, ensuring that the grid is reinstalled, if you will, and put back up to specification to ensuring kind of long-term resilience.
Oh, very good point. As far as, you don't necessarily always think about, how that power is restored. You just know that it's restored. So that's a really good point there. You did mention storm patrolling as part of that, and that's really in the past been that foundation of storm response. But why is that a bottleneck to the rest of the restoration process? And I know you mentioned maybe a little bit in there about modernizing that. So could you just talk about that a little bit more?
For sure, yeah. I mean, storm patrolling, we think of it, and most utilities think of it as the critical path activity because obviously nothing else can begin in terms of restoration until the damage is located and assessed. And, of course, it's about pulling equipment eventually out of inventory and going and reinstalling it, but it's also a safety concern, right? Like, so that damage needs to be assessed to ensure that those crews can go out and safely restore power. And so again, defining kind of starting with the current process as it sits today, traditional manual inspections can typically move at 2 to 3 miles per hour. So it's often done with multiple specialized personnel in a vehicle, right? It's done by vehicle. And so you'll have a driver, you'll have a passenger who's assessing damage, kind of looking out the passenger side window. And because of that very nuanced process and, it's time consuming, the vehicles typically move pretty slowly. Contrast that and talking about the future with kind of AI-enabled vehicle inspection. So instead of having two people in the vehicle, you can have one. You augment your fleet vehicle with cameras, for example, mounted on the roof, and that assessment process is much less nuanced, and it's happening automatically by the cameras and the AI. So effectively, what that enables you to do is drive at posted speed limits versus really slowly, which ultimately equates to faster coverage. Could be up to 5 to 10 times faster coverage in terms of the number of poles and infrastructure that you're inspecting in that period of time. And so that single generalist driver can now accomplish what previously required two specialized crews, while AI detects the technical defects like open cutouts and transformer damage that even sometimes the trained eyes might miss.
Yeah, I never even really thought about the idea of the speed limit, so that's interesting. And that did like you did address kind of my next question a little bit, because that is a problem for utilities. We've heard them talk about how they lack people during events. I mean, they do have mutual assistance, but them there as quick as they can sometimes can be an issue. So does this really, you think, help those? I mean, is this kind of a new approach that might help them with those resource limitations? I mean, are there other ways too?
Yeah, I mean, I think, looking at this, the answer isn't necessarily more people, right? It's not just
Hmm.
more bodies at the scenario. Um, Increasing capacity in storm events, like, isn't necessarily easy as well because you have multiple utilities potentially competing for that same pool of resources in the form of people that can go out and be deployed to assess damage. So it's less in our view around just adding capacity in the form of more people. It's about multiplying the productivity of those existing people, those existing resources that are out in the field. So, for example, when thousands of mutual aid workers converge on a storm area, they often have varying levels of inspection expertise, right? And AI-enabled systems ensure consistent inspection quality regardless of that individual crew experience, right? So you're able again to shift toward just having a generalized labor pool versus some folks that are very specialized, which means potentially you can cast a much wider net and have more people available for that storm response. And then in addition, deploying single operator vehicles, as I mentioned previously, can cover 5 to 10 more times of the poles or ground per hour, which means that utilities could potentially deploy twice as many inspection vehicles with that same personnel count. So again, if just simple example, you have 1,000 people doing storm response the old way, that's 500 vehicles, right? Because you have two people per vehicle. And the
Hmm.
new paradigm, you could have 1,000 vehicles, right? One person per vehicle, and that also gives you blanket coverage, and is crucial for assessing that damage faster. And the last point that I'll make on this, and we continually talk with not just large investor-owned utilities, but smaller municipal and cooperative utilities as well. And what we've heard from them is they're often waiting for those mutual aid resources. Like the resources sometimes get sucked up, for lack of a better term, by the IOUs, by the investor-owned utilities. And so the municipal and cooperatives have kind of left in the lurches waiting for their resources. So for them, AI-enabled damage assessments can really kind of level the playing field.
Okay. That makes sense. So, when you talked about the 360-degree approach, you did talk about kind of pre-storm, and that is something that we've covered too when we cover, when a storm's coming, what's involved with that. But how can pre-storm preparedness and kind of that proactive maintenance, can that reduce the severity of storm damage and maybe help accelerate that restoration when the storms do occur?
Yeah, so for sure. I mean, the way that utilities perform, we'll call them blue sky inspections of infrastructure, like not during the storm event, not a damage assessment post-storm, but under blue sky conditions, is usually a pretty cyclical, rigid maintenance schedule. So they might look at 10% of their distribution grid per year. So it's a 10-year cycle to get adequate coverage across all 100% of your service territory. That makes it challenging because on any given year, when you're looking at that 10% of your grid, the other 90% might have conditions that, if left untreated during a storm, could lead to an outage. And, had you treated that condition, it might not have led to an outage, right? Because you harden the grid. So the rigid maintenance schedules is, the status quo. Again, shifting that on kind of its head, AI enables precision interventions. So again, it's all about continuous data collection from, for example, vehicle-mounted cameras, creating real-time vulnerability maps under those blue sky conditions, identifying the types of conditions and defects that I mentioned previously, like poles that are leaning too far, insulators that are cracked, transformers that are aging, vegetation that's encroaching, and doing all of that before the storms arrive. Ultimately, it's really shifting resource deployment from reactive repairs to proactive strengthening of weak points. And so when storms do hit, the grid enters from a position of strength, as we like to say, with damage that's smaller in scope, to your point about severity, and crews that are better positioned and better staged in certain geographic areas based on that vulnerability map and that predictive analytics that happened under the blue sky conditions.
Yeah, let's get to cost real quick and maybe the financial benefits. So, is there a way for utilities to calculate the direct financial benefits of the faster restorations? And that, maybe that's with reduced overtime, fewer truck rolls, how can they do that?
Yeah, I think the math is pretty straightforward once you shift metrics from hourly crew rates to poles inspected per hour.
Okay.
We often see RFPs for storm damage assessment, and typically vendors are bidding on that work on a purely hourly rate basis. And so traditional two-person crews, just throwing an estimated number out there, could cost somewhere in the range of, let's say, 250 an hour. And given the speed at which they're performing assessments, they might cover 50 or so poles, distribution poles per hour. So if you do that math, 250 divided by 50, it's $5 per pole inspected. Again, if you contrast that with AI-enabled kind of single operator systems, that hourly rate, and oftentimes these systems aren't built on an hourly rate, but if you do the translation into an hourly rate, it's fractions of that 250 an hour, and you're able to inspect many more poles per hour. So let's say instead of 50 poles per hour, it's 300 poles per hour. So what we've seen is utilities can get an up to 10 or 15% cost reduction in just that labor efficiency alone. And then if you factor in kind of the ancillary things like overtime savings from faster overall restoration, not paying overtime as much, reducing the truck rolls because you have that better damage prioritization, even in those blue sky conditions, then that multiplier effect, as we like to call it, really becomes substantial. So it's something that's really beneficial to utilities, and there's a direct path to calculating it.
What about indirect, like losses or financial losses during outages? Like unrealized energy supply and delivery charges. I know that's a big topic right now with the government too. They're looking at some of that. So, How can faster restorations really help minimize that? Is there a way for that to happen?
Yeah, so I think, those indirect financial losses are often hitting cost and also
Hmm.
often exceed visible restoration expenses. So, I mean, you've got, your labor for storm patrollers, the equipment that you're pulling out of inventory, that's all direct. But the indirect is, okay, for the period of time that the power is out, we were not selling power to people, right? So there's a lost revenue there. And in our analysis, we did run an analysis on this, and we found that utilities can lose anywhere from $800,000 to $1.5 million per day for every 100,000 customers without power, just in that unrealized supply and delivery revenue lost alone. So, for example, Hurricane Beryl's 11-day restoration a couple years ago,
Mm-hmm.
we estimate cost center point approximately 89 million in indirect revenue separate from those direct restoration costs. So every hour shaved from that damage assessment process, again, accelerates that entire restoration timeline, directly recovering those lost earnings. So even modest improvements can make a significant impact here.
Wow, yeah, every hour could count with that kind of cost. Wow.
Mhm.
Beyond the finances, and we talk about this to a T&D world, but what about indirect benefits? Like customer satisfaction, regulatory goodwill. I know with Beryl there was some issues with that. Reputational trust. What those are harder to measure, but you know that can be gained too, right?
Yeah, yeah, very important. Extreme weather events are inevitable, like they're going to happen no matter what, and it's out of anyone's control, including utilities, right? It happens. But I think a well-coordinated response, and especially one that's communicated from a PR perspective, can actually ultimately enhance utility reputation rather than damage it. So faster, more accurate damage assessment that, like we talked about, enables better estimated time of restoration communications, right? Because you're getting very granular objective damage assessments back into the command center quickly, which informs that estimated time of restoration calculus, right? But all of that, those communications, like communicating that early and often, manages customer expectations much more effectively. Also, regulatory bodies increasingly are, as we all know, scrutinizing restoration performance. And so then there's FEMA documentation. I mean, there's many
Hmm.
layers to this, but like, especially if you're a smaller utility, you have to kind of prove the pre-storm condition and then the post-storm condition. So just using AI systems to automatically create GPS tagged audit trails that meet these standards while enabling more transparent public communication about restoration is like meaningful progress. And ultimately, trust amongst anyone, ratepayers, customers, right, is built through that consistent, reliable performance. And that starts with more accurate situational awareness, which AI can enable.
I do have a kind of a question about like the concept of AI. How does technology and human expertise really work together in this modernized storm response vision? And is it more appropriate to view the emerging AI analytics as process automation, or is that an augmentation of human expertise? I mean, I think that will really help inform our audience about, what that means.
Yeah, I mean, I think despite what we might read about ChatGPT and other
Mhm.
headlines around large language models and things, which oftentimes is, hyperbole in many cases, humans are still necessary. Humans are still in the loop, as we like to call it. And I think specific to the process and the topics that we're discussing today, it's a combination of both, right? It's clearly process automation on the data collection side. So again, you're driving posted speed limits, you've got cameras and AI, you're collecting that damage assessment data much faster in a very automated way. So it's automation from that perspective, but human expertise augmentation on the decision making side. So that doesn't go away. And again, the way to think of it is AI is handling the time intensive repetitive work of going out in the field, identifying and cataloging damage, finding the needle in the haystack, but the human judgment remains central, right? Really, for prioritization, resource allocation, complex repair decisions that often involve trade-offs. So, it's really an augmentation of that human in the loop.
Hmm. Okay, nice. A couple more questions before we wrap up, but this is a really important thing that we shouldn't, leave without addressing. What role does a safety play in kind of rethinking the storm response?
Yeah, for sure. We think that safety improvements occur at multiple levels. Generalist drivers, as we talked about earlier, can now
Hmm.
focus entirely on road safety, while AI handles the technical damage detection, so reducing the need to stop, for example, in hazardous conditions, which improves safety. Faster overall damage assessment also means that repair crews can begin work with better situational awareness of system-wide conditions. So again, that AI detected damage assessment is very granular and detailed, and crews in the field can be armed with that situational awareness when they're going out to perform their repairs, right, which helps ensure their safety. And perhaps most importantly, post-restoration reinspection prevents future failures that could endanger both workers and the public. So that quality control on the third leg of the 360-degree storm response, storm awareness stool isn't just about reliability. It's about ensuring that rebuilt infrastructure meets specifications that protects everyone who interacts with the grid, right? Because if the grid isn't restored to spec, it's not just like I mentioned about reliability, there could be safety concerns with that.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So we talked throughout kind of what the benefits are from this, this 360 approach and being able to use the AI approach. But what practical benefits can you add that utilities could expect if they do adopt this more modernized approach, for their crews, for their operations, and for their customers?
Yeah, I mean, I think this question's great because it ties together a lot of,
Hmm.
what we talked about prior, but basically for crews, right, the boots on the ground, really the frontline folks, it's better situational awareness, it's safer working conditions, and it's a deployment focused on skilled repair work rather than time-intensive, mundane inspection tasks. So that's the benefits as we see them for the crews. For operations teams, for example, in the command center, it means faster restoration times, improved resource utilization. We talked briefly about FEMA documentation, documenting the before and the after,
Hmm.
streamlining that process of getting that documentation, which means your recovery dollars could come easier, and also the predictive maintenance capabilities that strengthen the grid over time. So those are benefits that operations teams would see. And then for customers, perhaps the most obvious ones are, shorter outage durations because again, you're assessing that damage faster, more accurate restoration time estimates. So going back to the utility and the operations center having more granular data, which informs their ETR estimates, and then communicating that early and often to the public, right? That ends up being a benefit to the customer and improves the utility's brand. And improved long-term reliability as the grid becomes more resilient with each storm cycle. So again, the 360 approach isn't just about the response, it's about having the intelligence to harden in advance of the storm and ensuring the grid is rebuilt to spec. So all of that together with each storm can actually strengthen the grid and make it more resilient versus less.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. So one more question before we wrap up here. Looking ahead, what do you see the future of storm response looking like? And what would be some first steps that utilities can take to get to that?
Well, this could be a bit of a hot take, I would say, but from my perspective, the future belongs to utilities that transform storms into operational setbacks, into opportunities for grid modernization.
Mm.
And, as such, like leading utilities will use each weather event as a data collection opportunity, and layering AI on top of that, generating the insights that can strengthen that future resilience. So, like I mentioned previously, over time, the grid's actually becoming more resilient. But it really takes multiple steps to get there. And, it's not just go out and change your existing business process on day one, right? The way that you've been managing storms for the past 50 years, right? It's really an incremental approach. So we think that successful utilities that have started down this path will often start by rethinking those procurement methods from hourly rates to those performance-based outcomes, like how many poles are you inspecting, and starting with pilot deployments, like starting small, land and expand, so to speak, with pilot deployments, leveraging your existing fleet vehicles, deploying a few cameras, doesn't have to be a lot, doesn't have to be cost prohibitive, really enable the technology to demonstrate a quantifiable ROI. And once you have that ROI, scale that approach across the traditional storm response workflows. And the last point I'll make on this is that the technology is ready today. It's been battle tested, it's been hardened. The question is whether utilities will lead that transformation or will be forced to follow as customer and regulatory expectations continue to rise. So it's a
Yeah,
critical time.
for sure. Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Chris. This has been a great topic for our audience. That's all I have for today. So, like I said, thanks again for joining us, and thank you all of our viewers for tuning in.
Thank you.